computer. Okay.
There we go.
There you go.
All right. Good afternoon, you guys. This is the Grief BeLIEF podcast, and today we have a great guest for our panel, and our guest is Karen Hatfield. And Karen, can you describe your background and so on? Because I don't want to butcher it, even though I'm familiar with it.
Sure. I'm Karen Hatfield. I'm currently the Chief Program Officer for the Gathering Place in Cleveland, Ohio. My background that brings me to this group is that for the past 20 years, I've had experience in hospice bereavement, overseeing hospice bereavement programs and grief support in the community, things like support groups, crisis response, grief in the workplace, all those kinds of things. So the majority of my work in this area has been with families who've had the death of a loved one, primarily after a hospice experience, working with those families after they've had a hospice experience, and just a lot of learning in terms of people's stories and the real natural nature of grief, and how I've just learned a lot about how we either try to ignore it entirely or we completely pathologize it. And so, that's kind of my background in a nutshell, but I'm happy to be here now and certainly learning a lot about grief and its impact even in the cancer journey through the work that I'm doing here at the Gathering Place.
So I was intrigued by your credentials after your name. And so I can't remember them all, but can you just tell us about some of your credentials?
Sure. I have a master's degree in music therapy. I'm a board certified music therapist. And in the hospice bereavement world, there is not one credential that makes a person be a bereavement professional and a grief professional in the hospice world. With the experience and continuing education and just having done that work, that builds that credential, and not the credential, but that builds the kind of your expertise over time. So the other letters, it's funny, as we get older, all these letters appear. I have also a certified hospice and palliative care administrator. That's a certification that I hold as well. So again, that extensive background in hospice and hospice bereavement is kind of where I come from. Prior to really getting into hospice, that music therapy background really created in me an interest in people's stories, and an interest in really just being present with people when they are in times that are difficult. And that really led me to hospice and a real love for grief and loss.
And what specifically was it that connected you to grief and loss?
Mm-hmm. I think in my work as a music therapist, I worked a lot in end-of-life care and in long-term care. And again, just seeing what people are grappling with as they're coming to the end of their lives, that anticipatory grief, the way that sometimes people's grief is disenfranchised and minimized by those in the world around them. And again, that just love of people's stories and hearing in people's stories, there's always some layer of loss, and that it's so very normal. And that we don't have a great comfort level in this world of just sitting with someone's grief and their intense reactions. And I've really come to learn that intense reactions are often very normal. And we panic at other people's intense reactions sometimes. And I just found that I had a real comfort level with sitting with people who are grieving or experiencing something that other folks don't really maybe have the tolerance to sit with. And so that's kind of what led me down this path.
I have a question. Do you find yourself as a bridge? So my husband died of pancreatic cancer, fought it for 11 months, and the level of lack of understanding, tone deafness in the healthcare system for the first hospice we went with was the same. We said what we needed and what we wanted, and then they did the opposite while I was away.
Oh, goodness.
Basically, the social worker asked my husband where he wanted to be buried when I wasn't there.
Oh, goodness.
And, we were beginning to have these conversations, but
Mhm.
do you find yourself kind of bridging the misunderstandings or the lack of listening or anything like that when you are doing your work, either with medical professionals, with family members when someone is dying? I don't know if that question is clear, but
I think my understanding of the question, I guess my answer to my understanding of the question is certainly anyone who has that capacity to listen and to hold that space can be that bridge.
Yeah.
Because often things happen along the way, like the conversation that you described, feels like it should have obviously been made with both of you present. And for whatever reason that didn't happen. And then you're left with that as an ongoing memory of how something went awry that didn't really need to go awry. And so I think the folks that I have worked with I had a very large bereavement team in my last position, and I have a great team of clinical counselors here at the gathering place. And, sometimes it is just us being able to hold those stories for a person that helps to be that bridge so that you can do something with those feelings that you're left over with. So you said you're not sure if your question made sense. I'm not sure if that answer made sense, but to be able to hold
great.
space for someone can allow that person to feel like someone's hearing them, because we can't change what happened in the past. And you've got to be able to do something with it. Otherwise it sticks with you. And those aren't the things that you want to have stick with you necessarily.
So Karen, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
I am curious, and if this is too personal, feel free not to answer it. But I am curious if something personal happened in your life to take you down this path.
Yeah, I think, lots of, obviously we all have these paths that you're not entirely certain what happens along the way. Prior to going into the hospice world, my mom died, and I didn't really know a lot about grief reactions. I certainly had not had that level of a loss of my own in my previous life. And I didn't realize that all of the things that I thought were kind of wacky that I was doing are very normal grief reactions. I tell the story a lot. I remember one day at work, I just kind of left and I ended up in my living room making like a mixtape, because tapes were actually a thing at that point in time. And I was like, oh goodness, I mean, that's not a thing you do. You don't just kind of leave. And I wasn't that far away. I came back, but I'm like, that's kind of, now I know. I kind of couldn't take any more that day. And I removed myself, and I did something creative with that and used music, which is one of my tools. At the time that she died, I was looking for support that I didn't know how to find. So I didn't know about things like grief support groups. I didn't know that my mom was not cared for by a hospice. So I didn't know about hospices having that kind of support. So my own experience definitely gave me a sensitivity to what those families go through, and an interest in being a part of making that known and available to people, because I didn't have that for myself. And I've just outed myself that I left work 25 years ago and went and made a mixtape in my living room. But now I get it. That loss of concentration, that I've hit my wall for today and I need to remove myself from this situation. All very normal things.
Yeah, we call it running out of cope. You just have to go and self-soothe for a little bit.
Yeah.
They're there.
Yeah.
So, of the various types of approaches to grief, and let me first ask, what's the difference between grief and bereavement?
Well, for me, we've always, in my world, always kind of talked about grief as the internal. Having a bereavement is having had a death, and kind of that difference between grief and mourning is more what my brain tends to go to. So my grief is my internal, it is my reaction, and my mourning is my outward expression of those things. And my past is also different from what you all do in your lives, because the hospice bereavement and the supportive services like that we offer here at the Gathering Place are not counseling, they're not therapy, but it is really walking with a person through their journey and providing support. And when those needs are beyond what our team would do either here or in my past professional roles, it's helping folks find that different support that they might need out in the world.
Can you give some thoughts about one, how do you know when it's time to go into hospice? For example, Jimmy Carter went into hospice 9 months ago. Rosalind Carter went into hospice last week and died. I am primary caregiver for my late husband's mother, who's 100.5.
Wow.
Still living at home with basically relatively minimal care. So how do you know when it's time to have someone go into hospice, and how do you have the conversation?
Gosh, I think that's so hard for different families, so people have such different levels of comfort with talking about whatever is happening, whether it's truly somebody who's facing an end of life situation or some other medical thing. So the answer is maybe not the same for each family, but that general rule of if a physician would say that it would not be surprising to them that this person in front of them would maybe have months rather than years, if your treatment path is going to be more palliative rather than curative, that could be a time to really talk with a hospice representative. The way that I used to, and my side of hospice was always the bereavement piece, so I, not involved in the admitting folks. But what I shared with friends in the past 20 or so years is it never hurts to make the phone call. If you feel like it's something that might be appropriate, that hospice team is never going to admit your loved one to that care if it's not an appropriate level of care. So if you're seeing those declines, if you have a diagnosis that is a terminal diagnosis, and if your path at that point is not curative anymore, that could be a time. The world of palliative care is great because it's kind of not that hospice level yet, and that sometimes is more palatable for people to talk about. People have a very strong feeling that hospice means like it's those last few days. And the best hospice care can be really provided when people have those several months or however long is appropriate and they're eligible for the care to really have that extra support, those extra eyes on the person, the support from the team for the family so that the family can be relieved of some of those burdens, and the chance to just talk and be a family and do some of that anticipatory grief work, and support each other and get support that way.
I've noticed in my practice, when the families do have a longer hospice period, it allows that time and focus to say, okay, let's talk about the things that, we've neglected to say. And it just seems to be a gentler entry into the grieving process.
Yeah, especially when there are kids involved too, because you can get support and have support for kids and get some of that language. In the grief world, I've always just been a big proponent of helping people to have the language to create some of the coping before you're in the crisis to need it. And I think that can go a long way.
Can you give any examples of what that language might sound like?
Yeah, we talk a lot in my experience, we've talked a lot with families about even using words. People like to use a lot of metaphors and things that then just get confusing. Like in the kid world, if someone has died, we talk about what death is and that someone has died, not someone has gone to sleep, or using metaphors or gone on a long trip, because then what happens when I go on a long trip? Does that mean the same thing as when grandma went on a long trip and didn't come back? So being concrete with people, giving people real information, not over informing people, but giving you the information that you can manage at the time that you need it, particularly in the kid world, in terms of what's developmentally appropriate. You're going to certainly speak to your 16-year-old in a way that is different than your 4-year-old. So that kind of thing.
Mhm. Mhm. So can you tell me a little bit about what the Gathering Place is? I know that just from my own direct experience that it mostly focuses on all sorts of programs for families touched by cancer, and it isn't a focus on death and dying necessarily, but
Right.
Can you explain how that works?
Yeah, I'm so excited to be a part of the Gathering Place. I started with TGP in July, so I'm reasonably new to this world, but the Gathering Place provides amazing programs and support and education for folks who are touched by a cancer diagnosis. So that could be the person who has cancer, it could be members of their family, anyone who is associated with that person. We have a number of amazing support groups that are truly support groups. Then we have, opportunities for people to be able to talk with a physician or learn information about your cancer in an educational format with other folks. We had a program a month or two ago, chat with a pharmacist who came in specifically to talk about pharmacy issues related to prostate cancer. So, just some of those really, in the same way that I didn't know that the grief resources existed when my mom died, I didn't know about this huge world of support that's available through places like the Gathering Place for support and education. We have amazing movement and nutrition programs that are some of the best attended things that we do. There's so much information out there about nutrition and supporting your needs in the cancer journey through your nutrition and continuing to move. So we have all of those programs. The best part about all of our programs is that they are free to anyone who needs them. And that's through, the donations of many, many individuals and foundations and organizations. We have an amazing medical librarian on our staff who gets our folks connected with people like our volunteer attorneys. And she also is just such a wealth of knowledge to be able to sit with someone who has received this news. And, if you're in this situation hearing news and you're kind of taking some of it in, but not quite, Eileen will sit with a person and go through everything that they received for that information or go through their labs and their scans with them to help put it into language that a person can really understand. It's that language piece again. What do I need to be able to digest this in language that I can understand? So just so many things. We have two amazing wig salons in each of our offices, so that watching really the transformation of a person who comes in for a wig appointment, who is feeling unsure, who's not sure what this appointment's going to be like, who maybe just got a diagnosis or has already started losing their hair, to watch that person leave the building feeling like they are more confident, they've been listened to, they've been seen, they've been heard, has really been one of the greatest parts of my time here so far.
One of the things I love about it is when you go to the physical places, so they have a campus on each side of town, there's always some low-level soothing music, just kind of eliminating distracting noise, kind of like white noise. And inevitably, as soon as I step in, I just feel my blood pressure go down. And there's a healing garden. There's a wonderful program for kids that are dealing with parents or grandparents or other family members that are going through the cancer journey and so on.
Yeah.
So in the context of grieving and bereavement, have you gotten to the point where you're ever tired, or it's a little too much that you have to step away?
Well, I am really a sucker for people's stories. And I had a very wise person on my previous team tell me a long time ago, a woman who had been doing grief work for over 30 years. And I asked her, like, how do you do this? This was early on in my hospice career. And I said, how how do you keep this fresh for you every day or whatever? And she said, there's a lot of commonalities in grief, but the person that I'm about to meet, I've never met before. And their story is their story individually. And they've never gone through this before. So in never looking at anybody's stories like it's kind of old news to us, there may be commonalities, but every interaction we have the ability to make something better. And I think I've carried that, and my team here carries that with them as well. Every person is an individual and every story is unique, and we can play a small role in making something better. So.
And that's what I view my role. But I think the other part I experience, and I've been trying to observe it, is I kind of grieve their loss. That part of their story includes that. And, it makes me profoundly sad for them. So, Christy, anything else you want to ask? Because you're normally a really good questioner.
Well, it's funny because I was going to ask that exact question. It's the question I had next that I wanted to ask was, do you ever get burned out? And how do you walk through that? But I also had a question about, could you just talk a little bit about anticipatory grief? I think there's some people who don't really understand what that is, or might not. They might understand it once you explain it, but and how do you handle that in the gathering place?
Yeah. I think it's really interesting here, particularly because people going through this cancer journey may not, grief might be something that they didn't expect to be talking about this. You get kind of hit with all of here's the practical stuff that you're going through. And when that idea of anticipatory grief, I love, there's the definition of anticipatory grief. I used to do some continuing education and we put the definition up, and it's like that opportunity for a person to anticipate their own losses or their own death. And it sounds very kind of, intellectual. But it's all of those losses that are happening, the current losses, past losses, anticipation of future losses. So it could be death related, but it could also just be, this thing has really come into my life and it's shattered thoughts of what I was going to do for the past year. Maybe people get through their treatment, and when it's over, it's not really over, because then a lot of folks I've learned from my team here have that, oh my God, what just happened to me moment. So there's that having to process what that's been about. Maybe my body has changed, maybe my relationships have changed. And so all of that kind of rolls into that grief and loss, potentially that anticipatory grief. Disenfranchised grief is another big thing for people, because if I've come through this and I feel like, what do I have to complain about? I got through it. People will tell you, oh, you should be so grateful, because I can tell you 16 other stories about people who didn't have it as good as you. All that does is set us up for competition and to feel like my grief has to be minimized, because who am I to grieve when it could have been so much worse? And so we want to, and we do provide that space for people to say, like, your feelings are your feelings. And this is your journey, and you're allowed to feel about it however you feel about it. And I'm sure that you all have experienced that too, because there's enough grief to go around, unfortunately, and it isn't a competition. And I feel like people often feel like they can't acknowledge it or are embarrassed to acknowledge it because I should be something else.
That's one of the first things we talk about in, I'm a grief recovery method specialist. And one of the first things we talk about is how important it is to not compare your grief stories with other people's grief stories, and even with your own. There's a lot of people who feel horribly guilty that they the grief over the loss of their dearly loved pet was stronger and more intense than the grief over a parent. And there's, it causes a lot of horrible feelings inside. And it's one of the first things we talk about, like, don't compare your losses. Everybody experiences grief at 100%. And everybody's grief story is valid. And there's this quote I love. It's all loss deserves to be honored with grief. And I think that's beautiful.
Yeah.
Really is.
Yeah. I was going to say, I think it's David Kessler, and I'm going to get the quote wrong, but I think he says something like, the worst grief is your grief right now. So again, that idea that I'm entitled to it, and grief needs to be acknowledged, and to find people who will let you acknowledge it and who will sit with you with it, is a real gift. To have friends, and so much of what we do in grief is that informal supporting of each other. And it's as important to just know that your grief is normal, and that telling your story over and over again and sharing the memory is what's going to help you integrate. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to get professional help because you're grieving and you feel sad, or something spikes up and you have a wave of grief. I think just helping people understand that you live with it and you share it and you tell it, and to find those informal resources too is really helpful.
For me in New York, it's Gilda's Club,
Mhm.
which was set up by Gilda Radner, well, in honor of Gilda Radner by her husband and her partner, and sounds similar to the Gathering Place.
Mhm.
And for me, my husband had pancreatic cancer for 11 months. And I think that's right. And it was a place where I could go and whine, you know, when I was having a hard time, when he was saying, I'm the one with cancer. There was a point, so they sort of move you from group to group. So he had a group for people with cancer. I was in a group of, you know, being a family member of someone with cancer. And then he died, and I was a widow. And then they wanted me to move into the bereavement group, away from this group I'd been with for 9 months. And I was like,
another loss.
Yeah.
Another loss, right? Because I had this network of support, and then I was going to be punted. I was going to get one visit to say goodbye, and then
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the way you describe that, even just feeling like kicked to the curb, you know,
Yeah.
and that's of course not the intention, but that's how you feel. It's another loss because
it was another loss. And
all these people, it's how you got through.
Exactly. And Gilda's Club was absolutely a godsend, but I certainly had friends whose husbands lived, who are still afraid every year when there's the checkup. And yet they're told that, you know, you should be grateful. So it's so complicated because the feelings are so confused.
Well, that's the thing. I can be grateful and I can be grieving. Like you constantly have to tell people you don't have to be one or the other. I can be grateful that this is where I am. I can be grateful that it wasn't worse. And the whole thing could still have been awful. And I still might feel awful. And, you know, I think you bring up a good point when you are the bereaved and your husband has died and you have friends who have not had the same outcome, that can cause that friction. And you might feel some of those losses or that change in relationship, you know, with your social group too, because neither really knows how to act around the other potentially, you know. And I think it's one of those things to kind of, that almost has to be brought right out into the open to say, here's where we are. And for us to remain friends, let's kind of bring this out in the open, because you don't want people tiptoeing around you, you know.
Well, it was interesting because the friends that I still see are from the group before my husband died. I don't see any of the people from my bereavement group.
Interesting.
Because over those 9 months, there was such a bond going through that experience together.
Support groups are so important.
So important. But I love the idea of the wig thing.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
They even have a mobile unit now, from what
I was going to say, one of the things that we're working very hard on is to help provide services outside of these two physical locations. I happen to be in my office in one of our locations, but to help bring our services, to folks who are outside of these walls. The Cleveland area is a large geographic area, so we are making strides to go to where people are, to serve more diverse communities, to serve people who can't, for whatever reason, come to us, or for whom it's not desirable to come to us in our physical locations. And we are working toward that ability to have the mobile van to provide, to go wherever people need us and provide those services, whether it's wigs, our individual services, some of our nutrition and movement programs, any of the things that we do, we want to be able to take to people wherever they are.
And they have art therapy, and they display a lot of the art. It's really a lovely place.
Yeah.
Karen, I'm interested in your thoughts about when to bring up the idea of grief when somebody's facing a critical illness.
I think, and I don't know if there's, there is no one answer to everything, but I think as you're listening to a person and helping to acknowledge the things that they are bringing forth, if someone is bringing forth reactions or thoughts that seem like they could be grief related, or talking about losses, or talking about the things that are changing, I think to gently say, these are losses that you're describing. And what you might be experiencing is grief.
Mm-hmm.
And a person can kind of, people will kind of either dig into that or they won't. But I think sometimes it's just acknowledging what you're hearing. And I wonder if that's it might be a grief reaction, and it's normal to feel grief with such upheaval in your life. Sometimes caregiver stress gets confused with anticipatory grief. But I think just acknowledging it and being that space for people is the biggest thing, because it's great to label and give language to, but the bigger benefit is to be there and to be able to listen and to give them a place to sort it out.
Yeah, I had an experience with a couple in my estate planning, and their daughter had estranged herself from them, and they were telling me, what was so, and I said, because of my training and the exposure to it, I said, you're experiencing grief. It had never occurred to them that was grief. It was, obvious to somebody else, but they were just so in the midst of it. In the meantime, they have created a group of other parents who have experienced estrangement, and now they're supporting each other. And it's just really wonderful to see. But it was just, I do think it's important to acknowledge that, this is a natural thing that's going on. And of course, it would be a natural thing to, be anticipating grief, etc. And there's resources for that if you need it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Are there any, we've talked a certain amount on this podcast about practices and rituals that are helpful to move through grief. Is there anything that you particularly like or recommend yourself from your years of experience?
I think one of the things that I learned a while back from another very wise person that I've worked with over the years is, we think of rituals as having to be these big things, like they have to be a memorial service or a big, and those are great things. And those rituals do help us to integrate our grief, to, solidify like the reality of the loss. But one of the most beautiful stories that I heard a long time ago was a woman whose husband had died, and her ritual every morning was to wake up and have her coffee in his favorite coffee mug. And that helped her to feel like it was a nod to him, an honoring of their relationship. And it allowed her to then move forward with her day, but it wasn't some grand gesture. So I think helping people to find what is meaningful to them is the right ritual. Because I know we don't do balloon releases anymore, but like there's balloon releases and write a letter and do stones and things like that. And those are all great. But the key is, what does it mean to that human, that one individual, and help them to find what it is for them. Taking a walk. My thing for still honoring my mom is around this time of the year. And this is really the only time of year that I do this. Her cinnamon apple tea. I start drinking that around fall because that's something she drank every night. I only do it at fall though, but that's my thing. And I think about my mom, I have my tea, and I'll do that for a few weeks here. And I have that's my ritual. And it seems to happen every year, this time of year.
That's sweet.
I have a ritual too that I do at this time of year. 5 years ago, I lost my mom, who was like my first best friend. I just adored her. I still do. She's amazing. But my mother was like the ultimate cat person. She was a cat lady. And so at Christmas time every year, she died in November. So the next month was Christmas. And I found this stuffed cat that just reminded me of my mom. And so every year at this time of year, I get a stuffed cat, and they all sit underneath my Christmas tree. It's just really, I don't know, it's a huge thing. It sounds like such a little thing, but it's a huge thing that just makes me feel closer to her and makes me happy. So I think that's a great piece of advice, just finding that very specific thing for your person. It's really cool.
I love that. I'd love to see these stuffed cats.
Right.
It's awesome.
Instead of 101 Dalmatians, it's going to be 101 stuffed cats.
Well, I think my grief and my thing that I do matters because it's the thing that matters to me. And I think this happens in trauma too. I don't have to understand what your reaction is for your reaction to be valid.
Yeah.
And I think the same things happen just in normal grief too. I don't have to, it's not mine to fully understand, but I can hold the space for you as you live with it. And yeah, everything's personal.
So in dealing with bereavement and so on, and listening to people's stories, is that different than when you may be talking to a young person or a child?
Mm-hmm. You mean in terms of someone who's actually experienced a death?
Mm-hmm.
I think, yeah, for someone older, I've done a lot of just that reminiscing and that kind of life review, and tell me how you met Martha, and kind of talking through the whole thing. My experience with kids is one of the things I did in my old life was run our grief camp. But I didn't spend scads of time constantly working with kids who were grieving, but that experience there really taught me, kids move in and out of these conversations. When I feel like grieving, they may feel like playing. When I feel like playing, that is going to be the time that your child might feel the need some more support. So that ability of children to move in and out of things, I think, is definitely different. For sure, talking with younger folks about the ways that this loss is going to impact them in the future is a piece of supporting someone who's had a death. And realizing that just like we can't change the past, we can't change that those things are now going to be forever changed too. One of the things during COVID that we talked a lot about in the grief world was the things that people were missing then, particularly young people, my prom being canceled or homecoming or graduation or any of those things. So looking ahead to what is it that you're going to be grieving when that next milestone comes around? That's definitely a different thing with younger folks than it would be talking with someone who's considerably older.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But,
So any particular advice or caution that you may share in terms of what you've seen that isn't supportive for those around somebody that may be a coworker, not necessarily somebody close?
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of them. The platitudes always kind of get people. I think people use platitudes because they mean well. And I've certainly done it myself when you kind of get tripped up and you might say the wrong thing. We've all done it. So, hopefully that there's some grace involved there. But I think imposing our own thoughts on what grief should look like we've talked before, is a thing to avoid. And even with this, I've always talked with people about try to avoid these things, because if my heart is in the right place, I also don't want to shame someone for having tried but gotten it wrong. Yeah. So I think the platitudes, imposing our own beliefs on someone else, doing too much about, oh yeah, but let me tell you about when this happened to me. If we're really going to be there for somebody, really be there. Coworkers, I think if you're going to ask how someone is, be prepared for them to tell you. And make sure you've got the space and the time.
And if they cry, to be okay with that.
Yeah. I think we freak out when somebody has a reaction that we don't know how to deal with. And so, saying the person's name also isn't going to make them. It's not like if I don't say John's name, you've forgotten about him. So I think people really like to know what your memories are of the person, or ask a question, without being intrusive. But I love when people tell me stories about my mom, like when my friends reminisce about my mom growing up, because she was important to them as well. So I think anytime you can give the person that gift of something about the person who died, I think that's a great way for people to go.
I also think asking permission matters. Like, is it okay if I share a story I really love about? And then that person, let's say they're in the workplace and they don't want to cry, and hearing that right there might have them cry. Then they have license to go, not here, but I'd love to hear it somewhere else. So I talk to my clients a lot about they can have people ask for permission and actually get what they want.
And I think that's a wise thing anyway, in almost any setting, not just in grief work.
Yeah. I have talked to a lot of folks in workplaces who either have had an employee who's had a death, and then they're seeking support for how to support that person when they come back. And a lot of times I've told folks to try to have whoever the manager is, try to have a conversation with the employee before they come back, even though there's nothing written in stone, like, how are some of the ways that you would like us to handle this? Is there something I could put, like a knick-knack on my desk for a day that I feel like I need a little more space? So it's a nonverbal cue, so I don't have to constantly be, telling people I don't want to talk about this today. Letting people know that sometimes that first initial reaction when a person comes back to work, we're all anticipating that, and it's making all of us nervous. But getting through that first part, then you can, all of those, I'm so sorry, but I'm so glad you're back. Getting through all of those gets us to the next part of how do we learn now our new work patterns together, and how we support you in this space. So.
Well, I also think it's important to note that grief changes over time. So what someone needs when they immediately come back might not be the same. And as humans, I think we sort of like to know what to do.
Yeah.
And so if we get set in, okay, this is what we do, and they've just come back and we're just going to keep doing this,
you're right.
Then as the grief changes, that's the wrong thing.
You're right. Yeah.
You're
not following the rules, so to speak.
Right. Or I accidentally left the knick-knack on my desk today, but I really would like to talk to you. But now it's just become there. Now, I think that's such a good point, because we don't stay the same. Different things trigger us.
Yep.
For sure.
And so having a conversation, it would seem, if the manager had a conversation about, I know that the grief is going to change over time. So as it changes, let us know what you need next.
Yeah.
Because that person who's just gone through it has no idea what they need next. Like
Right.
there's no horizon.
Right.
It's just an endless.
Even if they've had a loss, another significant loss before, it doesn't dictate that the next one will be the same
Right.
path.
Yep.
Exactly.
So anything else we want to ask Karen about? I just really appreciate getting your insight on all of this.
Are there any book resources or anything that you would particularly recommend that you really love?
Mm-hmm. Oh, goodness. I was going to say, I'm sorry to admit that I'm not the biggest grief book reader. So, I think people love a lot of Alan Wolfelt's books. They're easy for people to digest. That idea of walking with someone and companioning is a very comfortable concept for folks. I tend to like humor that some other people might not like. And there are some grief books out there. The names are escaping me right now, but some of them are funny. And I think humor is such an interesting thing in grief, making sure that the humor comes from the person who's actually grieving. So you're not imposing that on them. So, I think there are so many things out there. Motherless Daughters was something that I read when my mom died. And I'd be interested to read it again now, because I think I would read it differently 20 years later. So I know there's just so many resources. Some of the kids' books, the little Chester Raccoon books, The Invisible String, just different ways to help kind of be a bridge when you're talking with kid about big issues.
Great, thank you.
Some of those.
Yeah, as grief has become more of a topic of conversation in general, I think that there are more resources for people to access at this point.
Yeah.
So on that note, Karen, and I don't know if you're in a position to answer this, but given the fact that, so many of our businesses have a broader reach because we're more online, how does that impact the gathering place? Do you consider yourselves regional or siteless, or what? Do you know?
Yeah. So having come into this agency after, pretty much after COVID, I'm coming in learning a lot about what was developed here during COVID. So, like everybody else, went fully virtual when things were shut down. But what we do here now, we have many things that are offered in person. We have a lot of programs that are offered virtually. A lot of the exercise and nutrition programs are offered virtually and in person, like a hybrid model. And we have a lot of folks who join virtually. The beauty of the virtual nature of some things is that people who are outside of our geographic area can attend. So that's definitely been a benefit. And I think we and everyone else will always have some virtual component. It's been really nice to welcome people back into the buildings, though. So, definitely people are taking advantage of that, and we'll keep doing that as well. So the biggest part about not being limited to these two buildings is the work that we're trying to do more outreach in the community and meet people where they are. So a lot of in-person that is in different places is some of what we're going for as well.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So sharing the link to the gathering place would be beneficial to it then.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, there's lots of if you're interested in our programs, there's a way to be registered on our website. And to get in touch with one of our participant navigators, you can do that by phone or filling out the registration online. There are lots of different ways to get in touch with us. And if all else fails, people can call me and I will help them get registered as well.
Okay. So
Thank you so much.
Any parting words or comments from anybody on the panel, including Karen?
This was so valuable. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, I'm so glad that we could make the time. We happened to cross paths and have that brief conversation, and it worked out. So despite my technology challenges that did not show up on screen today, at least.
It was so nice to meet all of you. I feel like I talked a lot. I was hoping to come here and learn more from you all.
That'll be the next time. We'll do that next time.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right, well, take care. And we have another podcast next month. Thank you.